Good morning. Ever since I created the Food Forest card game, and even before that, there have been certain things that kind of concerned me about the notion of food forests. And I think some of the misinterpretations that people have out there of what a food forest is and what it's good for. So I want to clear up some myths this morning so that you understand where I am in terms of what I believe you should use your food forest for, and some of the things that some of the mistakes I've made, and some of the things that I've learned along the way about just misconceptions around the notion of the food forest. First off, the biggest misconception, and I've talked about this before, so I won't go on about it a lot this morning, but the first misconception is that a food forest takes care of itself. And I've seen this happen so many times. People get excited about the notion of food forests, and they go and they do a lot of planting of long-term perennials. And then a year or two later, either they get bored from this project, or they think that, now I've done this is going to take care of itself. And what happens is that the way that plants work is in sort of a succession. So if you plant certain things, they will grow for a time, but then other plants will take over. And the succession that will occur is whatever the natural succession is in your environment. So you can start something and think that you've set this wheel in motion and now it's just going to take care of itself. What will happen is nature will come in and see what you've done, and it will kind of take it apart and rework it in a way that works for your natural ecosystem. It will turn it back into wilderness over the course of the next 15 or 20 years. It will not turn it into a productive food producing paradise. So creating a food forest and thinking it's going to take care of itself, fallacy number one, that's not going to happen. You need to manage a food forest. Fallacy number two, or myth number two, is that if you build it, they will come. And this is a trap that I fell into myself, and I'm glad that I built this particular arrangement that I did at a school where I used to volunteer, because it's nice that it's there, and I'm really still hoping that some champion will come along and mind that food forest that I left them. But the sad fact of the matter is, even after I built a group of parents who had all worked on this, I was the de facto leader of that group, and no other leader emerged. And this is not just what's happened to me. I've heard this about other people, especially people working with school programs, is while you are there and while you are the leader, then that food forest and any kind of garden situation, that will thrive. Once you step back, it is very difficult to build a group around this concept and get them to take care of this once the leader has left. And so if you build a food forest, that's terrific, especially in, say, like a school situation, but realize that this is something that needs to have a plan for after you depart. And creating the food forest and the committee around you as the inspiring leader, if it hasn't been something that several people have come together, and especially the administration and one of the teachers has come together around, then once you leave, it will slowly devolve into, probably some of the trees will turn into play structures until they're, knocked down, and the gardens will get trampled. So if you build a food forest, now this is also true about food forests that are like in community garden situations. Unless there is a committee that is all dedicated to this, and unless you are pretty certain that you have renewed interest and you have some sort of outreach program that actually continues to build the group that is focused around this food forest, it will devolve, and eventually it will do, like I said in myth number 1, it will eventually kind of revert to whatever the natural environment was before you planted it, or whatever nature intends for that space. It will no longer be the food forest, the productive food forest that you wanted. So if you build it, they will not necessarily come. You need to make sure that you have ensured that that succession of curators as well as the succession of species. Myth number 3. Poor neighborhoods need more food forests. Now this I know people will want to argue with me about, but honestly, poor neighborhoods need food security, and that's absolutely true. And food forests can be helpful in creating food security, but this kind of goes back to myth number 2, and that the whole "if you build it, they will come" myth. If you build a food forest in a poor community, the people, unless you have involved them from the very beginning in the planning, and unless they have decided that this is something they really need, then once you back away from the project, which you inevitably will, it will once again devolve into whatever that natural environment is. And in a poor neighborhood, that can be a park that has, similar to a park that has not been kept up by the city. And if you've ever been to a poor neighborhood and walked through a park that has not been kept up by the city or by the community, you will find that it has devolved into something that is probably not going to be the model that you had envisioned for your food forest. And so you need to, if you have an inspiration, and especially if you are not part of that poor community already. So if you are an outsider coming into a poor community and saying, this community needs more fruit trees, this community needs more food forests, you really need to check your ego at the door and ask that poor community what they want, because you might find that what that poor community needs is ethnic gardens that match the gardens from where they came and that they're familiar with, and they will get excited about that and they will take ownership of that, potentially. But coming in with this foreign notion of food forests and imposing it on a situation where it's not necessarily what other people will understand, you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, or vice versa. So poor neighborhoods need food security, but they need food security that they understand. Now, I'm saying this as somebody who's lived, who spent the first 16 years of his home ownership in a very poor neighborhood. And I planted fruit trees all around my yard, and I answered a lot of questions from people about what I was doing, why I was doing it. And I never once, through these discussions with people, I never once was able to bring somebody into the space and make them feel comfortable with it. And so this is a very important thing to realize. I was able to get a couple of people to try some of the cherries that I was growing on my fruit tree in the front yard, but they didn't understand the notion that this could be helpful to them in their environment. So a lot of people in poor neighborhoods are transient. They don't stay in their apartments or neighborhoods for as long as people in wealthier neighborhoods. So they don't have that feeling of ownership and commitment necessarily that you get from people who own their property and intend to be there for 5, 10, 15 years. They also don't have the background that you might expect them to come with, the understanding that, say, fruit and vegetables are healthy and important. They may or they may not, but you make all kinds of assumptions, and you need to really be careful about those assumptions you make when you go into a poor neighborhood and start planning for any kind of gardening program. You need to make sure that it is appropriate for the individuals that you want to engage with. Sometimes a food forest might be perfect, sometimes it just might not. Myth number 4, the environment needs more food forests. Now this is another kind of funny one, because in a way, the environment does need more environmentally respectful and responsible ways of creating food, of growing food. The environment needs people to become more responsible for distributing growth of food, which is one of the great things that a backyard food forest can do, and also just backyard gardening can do, is distributing the responsibility. And when you have a distributed system, rather than a system that gets all of its food from faraway places grown in giant agricultural plots, when you start to take ownership of that and take burden off of the system, then there doesn't need to be as many non-organic giant agribusinesses out there. But until we do that, there still will be. But does the environment need more food forests? The environment needs more wilderness. The environment needs more repair of degraded spaces. Does the environment need food forests? No, the environment needs wilderness. And so people need food forests. And that's a very, very important distinction to make. The environment needs wilderness, people need food forests. So if you take a space that was wilderness and plant it with food forest, you haven't helped the environment. If, on the other hand, you are an environmental scientist and understand succession of species, and you, say, work with Audubon to create different sort of different areas that are suited to different species that are native species. So say you're creating fields that will regrow and will, during that process of regrowth, attract certain species, and then you have established areas that you will let turn into more mature forest. And so you're creating wilderness situations like that. That's great for the environment. And edible species can be planted in with those rehabilitated landscapes. But the environment will plant and will help you to plant and regenerate those spaces. And so making the assumption that what the environment needs is a whole bunch of plants that are going to be consumed by humans, that's a very human-centric way of thinking of things. But birds will eat berries, and so berry plants are terrific, but you need to be thinking about the environment. You don't need to be thinking about food forests if your goal is to support the environment. If your goal is to support people, and if your goal is to support a decentralized type of agriculture, then humans need more food forests, humans need more backyard gardens, humans need a more holistic approach to growing food. So, but don't make the assumption that it's the environment that needs food forests. It's humans who need food forests. Very important distinction. The last myth I'm going to clear up today is that food forests are not practical for cold climates. And I feel like that is a big, big myth. And I've heard that over and over again. And I think what that is coming from is a myopic interpretation of what food forests are. If we just interpret a food forest as something that looks just like an old growth forest with lots of food plants growing in it, that's not going to work for a cold climate. However, the principles that forests use to maximize the utilization of the energy that comes into them. So that's a lot of words, but strategies that forests use can be mimicked in any climate. You need to look at the forests that you have in your climate. Look at the most productive parts of those forests. And in my cool climate, that is the forest edge. That is the most productive part of the forest. In some climates, that might actually be an area that has been burned in the middle of a forest and then regrows. I don't know, but I do know that in cold climates, if you study the way that forests grow and mature, and the most active times and the most active parts of those spaces, and the interactions between forests and fields, and you start to understand what makes the forest edge so productive, then you can use that forest strategy to plan your own perennial gardens. It's not really as much for annuals, although annuals can be certainly worked into a food forest situation. But you're looking at perennials when you're looking at forests, or you're looking at self-seeding annuals. So plants that will continue to seed themselves and that you can, as the curator of this space, harvest in a way that keeps that magic point in space and time as productive as possible. So if you, in a cold climate, plant and walk away, you're not going to have a food forest for very long. That goes back to the food forest take care of itself myth that I started with at the beginning. However, if you plant perennial edibles, harvest the ones that have become very abundant to make sure there's still room for those that are in the process of maturing or possibly aren't quite as competitive, then food forest strategies are very applicable to cold climates. Unmanaged food forests, not so much. So those are my 5 food forest myths that I wanted to clear up today. Myth number 1, a food forest takes care of itself. Myth number 2, if you build it, they will come. Myth number 3, poor neighborhoods need more food forests. Myth number 4, the environment needs more food forests. And myth number 5, food forests are not practical for cold climates. So I would like to know what you think about these myths, and are there other myths about food forests that we should be clearing up so that people don't come to this, too starry-eyed without a whole lot of practical knowledge of what will work and what may be more challenging. Please leave those comments below. Please give me a thumbs up, and I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel. I'm looking for 10 more subscribers this week if I can get them. And so I'm hoping that you will be one of them. All right. Thank you so much. Have an awesome day.